I want to make a disclaimer at the beginning of this sermon. Whenever I give a sermon that touches on the meaning or the purpose of church or why we come to church, I try to preface with some version of this. And the disclaimer is, and I truly believe this, as far as I am concerned, there is no wrong reason to come to church. Churches are big, broad, multifaceted institutions. They can do and should meet a variety of needs. And the reasons why we go to church and the benefits that we derive from it are going to change for us over time and over the course of our lives. And what we have to contribute to the church, the gifts that we have to bring, and the manner in which we will contribute, that's going to change over the course of our lives. So, when we say that the church should do a certain thing, or is at its best when it does a certain thing, I don't mean to imply that anyone should be here necessarily because of that certain thing. Maybe you're here this morning because your kids are in the RE program, and that is the most valuable thing about the church to you. Maybe you're passionate about environmental causes, and you want to meet other people who share that passion. Maybe you just like singing. Maybe you didn't want to be alone this morning. Maybe your friends are here. So whatever the reason is, there's no wrong reason to be here at UUI this morning. And whysoever you are here, welcome. We're very glad that you are here. Disclaimer out of the way. This year, we're talking about our 7 principles and the virtues associated with them, taking them, one a month. And in September, we talked about the inherent worth and dignity of each person and the practice of welcoming. And in October, we talked about justice, equity, and compassion in human relations and the related concept of solidarity. And so for the next 2 services, we'll be talking about our 3rd principle, which is acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. And I checked it to make sure that I didn't get that wrong. And next week, we'll talk in particular about the related virtue of openness, or as our Puritan Reverend John Allen would have called it, having a teachable heart. Now, I note that there is, once again, an interesting tension in our 3rd principle. As we found in the 2nd principle, a certain tension between the demands of justice on the one hand and compassion on the other, and how those 2 ideals can lead us in different directions and have to be resolved. So here we have acceptance on the one hand and encouragement to growth on the other hand. So it's sort of, I love you just the way you are, now please change. So balancing and reconciling those 2 values can be a little tricky, change and acceptance, and we're going to talk about that more in depth next week as well. This week we're going to focus a little bit more on the encouraging one another to spiritual growth part of the principle. And the other thing that I find interesting about our 3rd principle is that it's really the first of the 7 that addresses the whys and wherefores of church life. It's really the first to talk about coming to church, what that is and why we do it. We can, in splendid isolation, affirm the inherent worth and dignity of each person. We can purify our hearts, sitting in our parlor, and think benign thoughts about everyone. We can fight for justice, equity, and compassion all by our lonesome. Batman does it, bloggers do it, we can do it too. But our 3rd principle, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, assumes that this thing we call Unitarian Universalism will be done at some time anyway, together, in community, in a congregation. It assumes that church life is a part of religious life. And the fact that this is enshrined in one of our principles suggests that we also assume that it will ever be so for some value of ever. We choose to do religion together. And this is an interesting time in our church history when the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, or sort of umbrella organization, is urging us to also think beyond congregations, to think about what does religion mean outside of that model. And when Americans are increasingly embracing the status of spiritual but not religious, meaning they're interested in values. They want their lives to have depth and meaning and reverence. But they are not interested in organized church life, and they may actually view it as a negative thing. And so, in this environment, it behooves us to think carefully about how and why we do religion together, and this particular way of doing religion together. What does it mean to be a covenantal congregation, as UUIS? Why do we worship as members of a church body? Is it just habit? Is it just a nice thing to do? Is it a relic of our historical past? Or is it something more than that? Does the form itself contain some meaning that needs to be taken account? There are other models of how to do church that people are interested in. For example, as a really radical one, individual UUs could kind of connect over the internet, right? Come together for particular social justice events, come together for a big blowout one-off worship service, and then go their separate ways, kind of like religious flash mobs that would just spontaneously pop up. There's the missional church movement that places much less emphasis on worship and what we do in these buildings, and much more emphasis on what we do when we're part out in the community. Sometimes saying that church is what we do during the week, not what we do on Sunday. Or that it's not that the church has a mission, it's that the mission has a church. So it's a much different kind of emphasis. But I want to explore the idea that our third principle has something important to say about this question, and something important to say about why we do church the way that we do it. It is covenanted worship congregations, understood as a place where we encourage one another to spiritual growth. And I want to suggest that the unique way that we do it is potentially as radical and meaningful a form of social organization today, not just outmoded and stodgy, but as radical today as it was when our Puritan ancestors dreamt it up some 400 years ago. Now, when I say our Puritan ancestors, I don't mean that metaphorically. I don't mean like ancestors like, oh, they were the forefathers of this great nation. They're all of our ancestors. I don't know if everyone here knows this, but the Puritans are literally our ancestors, our religious ancestors. Because it was the congregations that they founded that became first Unitarian churches and then more recently Unitarian Universalist churches. Our second reading today was taken from the records of First Dedham in Massachusetts, founded 1638 by Puritans. And that church has been alive continuously for 375 years. And today it is still with us, First Church and Parish Dedham Unitarian Universalists. All of our oldest UU congregations were founded by Puritans, with the exception of King's Chapel, which was Anglican. Although they didn't call themselves Puritans, because Puritan was a term of abuse. They just called themselves Christians, and later Congregationalists. And their unique vision for how to do church life is still reflected in our organization, in how we do church, and in many of our values, and in our vision of what it means to encourage one another to spiritual growth. Now that is still central to how we do religion as it was to how they did religion, but our take on it has become a little bit different. And I want to expand on that a little bit. But first, I just want to talk about the Puritans a little bit, because Thanksgiving is coming up, and Pilgrims are in the air, right? They're part of our national conversation. We're going to see it on TV and in the stores and all that. We'll be revisiting the story of the Pilgrims in our Thanksgiving service. And, the Pilgrims kind of come in for a lot of abuse, and deservedly so, because they were kind of terrible in a lot of ways. But they're also our ancestors. And so as much as we talk about the ways in which they represent things we want to get away from, sort of the worst of our past, Calvinism and severe clothing and all of that, they also represent the best of us and parts of our past that is still alive today and that we should be very proud of. So the Puritans were tremendously excited about two things: religion and talking about religion. Should sound familiar. The simultaneous translation of the Bible into English and the invention of the printing press, which facilitated the mass distribution of those Bibles, meant that for the first time, God's word was literally in people's hands, unmediated by priests, uncensored by the church. People could literally crack it open and read for themselves what God was trying to say to them. And they could read about the history of the church, and they could think about it and apply that to existing institutions. And so within the context of their own time, what this meant, this sudden access to the Bible, was a release from spiritual stagnation of the old ways of doing religion and the opening of new gateways to tremendous spiritual growth, tremendous personal spiritual growth. If you've ever had the experience of coming out of an oppressive religious structure or an oppressive ideological structure or an oppressive family structure, which is not an uncommon experience for Unitarian Universalists. Many of us come to you from other churches or other backgrounds. Or if you've ever broken out of any spiritual straitjacket, even a self-imposed one, then you can relate, I hope, to that sense of freedom and lightness that they felt. That expansive sense of possibility when you're released from the bondage of something that is not you, and you can now be your authentic self. And you can think for yourself, and you can pursue your own path. That was their experience, and that's what motivated them in the things that they did. This tremendous excitement that they had the opportunity for authentic spiritual growth. People all over England were coming alive with that excitement, and some of them, they didn't want to pursue that excitement alone in their library. They wanted to get together with other people who were going through the same thing, and they wanted to talk about it, and talk about it, and talk about it over tea. And the problem was that talking about religion over tea at that time was the kind of thing that could get your head forcibly removed from your body. And so if you had opinions about religion, and they certainly did, there was strong incentive to keep those to themselves. But they didn't want to do that. Puritans were communitarian to the core. Doing religion in isolation didn't make any sense to them. It was the opposite of what they were about. As much as they believed that the private encounter of the soul with God was at the heart of religion, they also believed in the necessity of creating loving, supportive religious communities. That religion was expressed in encouragement of one another to spiritual growth, of being responsible to one another. You lift me up, I lift you up. We walk this path together. That was central to their view of what it meant to live as spiritual beings. And so, since they couldn't do that at home, they risked their lives and they took that vision over here so that they could create churches where they could covenant their mutual support to search for truth in the spirit of love, which hopefully sounds familiar. Now, like the Puritans, we still believe that the best way to encourage one another to spiritual growth is by coming together as a free church in a promise of love and support. The Reverend Alice Leslie Blair, whose men's lectures discuss our Puritan history at length and inspired some of this sermon, she puts this idea at the very heart of liberal religion. Right in our reading, she said, the center of a free church is a promise of fidelity, a covenant, which each member freely makes upon joining, our promise that we shall together seek truth and support one another. The free church is held together by the spirit of this promise. Now, there is a huge difference in the way we support one another in spiritual growth now, and the way we did it back when we were Puritans, inventing the concept of free communities. Because back then we were all Puritans, and if we weren't all Puritans, we made sure that we were all Puritans by just not letting people who weren't Puritans into our communities. And so, when they came together to share and walk together, they were sort of pre-screened. There was already a certain level of assumption that we're all coming from roughly the same place. And obviously, here in Unitarian Universalist churches, we've chosen over time to go completely the opposite direction, and we all make the assumption that whoever you are, whatever you love, whatever your beliefs and background is, you are welcome here. And we want that diversity, and we uphold it, and we support it, and we cherish it. So we're coming from a very different place when we talk about encouraging one another to spiritual growth. And that's not an easy thing to do, right? Accepting and supporting and encouraging one another is not an easy thing in any large community at any time. Just given the natural frictions, you've got different personalities, different interests, different inclinations, limited resources. But it's particularly not easy in a community that is as intentionally diverse as we are. So how do we navigate those tricky shoals? This is something that we're all learning together all the time. How do pagans and atheists and Christians and Buddhists and none of the above not only accept one another, but actively encourage one another to be the best pagan and atheist and Christian and Buddhist and none of the above that he or she can be? How do you do that? So our second reading comes from the historical record of the founding of that church of Dedham, Massachusetts, 1638, as recorded by their first minister, the Reverend John Allen. And I chose it today in part because I think it's charming, and in part because the approach that they took to creating a religious community together highlights, I think, some virtues that are timeless, that we can much profit by, that we would be able to emulate today. So the first Pilgrims had the luxury, dubious though it was, of having these long ocean voyages together. And on those ocean voyages, they could get a sense of each other's character and work out together exactly what kind of community they wanted, so that pretty much as soon as they landed, they could start, hammering up the church. They knew exactly how it was going to go. But by 1638, by the time the Dedham church wants to get going, enough people have immigrated to America and moved to different localities that these people were essentially strangers to one another. And they decided that before we're even going to start this process, because we want to support and encourage each other, because we want to be vulnerable to each other, because we want to be dependent on one another, we want to be thoughtful about this. We want to have a good sense of each other's strengths and weaknesses and character. And so, like Unitarians to this day, they had a lot of pitch-ins, and they had a lot of committee meetings. They went through a very long deliberation process. And the way they did it is kind of interesting. They decided on a set of questions that they wanted to be sure that they all understood and agreed on before they even started founding the church. They had these basic questions. Like the first question was, do we even have a right, biblically speaking, to start a church? Because at the time, that was an incredibly radical idea. That a group of lay people with no authority but their own could just up and start a church. Covenant together, pursue their own religious ideal, call a minister. That's how we do religion today. And it's still different from the way most communities do religion. But at the time, it was an incredibly radical idea. So that was where they started. Because everyone agreed that we're going to do this crazy thing. And then they had other questions, how it was going to be structured, who's the deacon, how are we going to do this, that, and the other thing. So they posted this list of questions so that everyone would have time to see it and reflect on it. And then they had a meeting. They went from household to household. And the head of the household, as was described in the second reading, lead them in prayer, give his opinion on the question at hand, and then the next person would speak, stand up and give their opinion on the question at hand, expanding or enlarging, and so on. And each person in turn would very respectfully speak their truth about what was being discussed. And the basic process reminded me of a chalice circle, because that's kind of the format that we use to encourage open sharing and deep listening when we get together in chalice circles. There's a basic question to be explored, and each person is given a turn to speak their truth while everyone else listens. And listens, as they say, with a teachable heart. And naturally, here there's a little bit different than a chalice circle in that there's a little bit more discussion and a little bit more debate. But we're told again that this was done without a spirit of cavilling or contradiction, so that they were peaceable, loving, and tender with one another. And when you read Puritan language, it's rather unfortunate that Puritans are now famous mostly for the unyielding severity of their judgment, even to the point of cruelty. So unfortunate, it's also their fault, but setting that aside, the ideals that they had for themselves when they talk about how they wanted to do community. They don't talk about hell, they don't talk about sin, they don't talk about judgment, they talk about meekness, mildness, humbleness, charity, tenderness, love. That's what they thought was at the heart of how you do religious communion together. And so that's a good summary of the tools that we need to support one another in spiritual growth as Unitarian Universalists. Meekness, mildness, humbleness, charity, tenderness, love. To which I would add patience and a good sense of humor. Because we've chosen a hard thing to seek to walk together as such a diverse community. And I want to return to my earlier question about the meaning of the form. Is what we do when we come together as a covenanted community itself meaningful? And I was thinking about Occupy Wall Street. When Occupy Wall Street got together and they set up these 10 communities, and they created their procedures for consensus. I don't remember them, but you did this if you agreed, and something else if you didn't agree, and they had this whole structure that they had created for participatory democracy. And the press came to them and said, "You've got our attention. What's your message? What are you trying to say?" And what the Occupy people said is, the medium is the message. And what they meant by that is, look at the community that we've created. Look at how we're living together. That's the message. We're pointing to a different way of being together. A different set of values that you can use to organize being together. A different possible way of living. That's the message. Now, I would suggest that to the extent that we practice not just acceptance of one another, but active encouragement to each other's spiritual growth, that in that sense, there's a message in that medium. In that sense, we're doing something kind of special here. Because here's the place where we uphold the maxim that we need not think alike to love alike. This is a place where we walk together, yet our paths are all different. They diverge. And we trust that in some sense they're going to come together, and that we're all headed in the same direction, and even when we're not, it will all work out okay. We even encourage each other to go off farther on a path that we don't know if it's going to come back around and connect us. We have to trust that it will. We trust in each other's strengths and wisdom, and we support each other in that. And that's an inherently risky thing to do in a community where we also seek to consciously deepen our interdependence on one another. When you enter a community, when you make it a part of your life, when me, for example, raise my children in it, say goodbye to my grandmother in it, when you come to trust and rely on one another, that's a vulnerable thing to do. And so when you make yourself vulnerable and you make yourself dependent, but at the same time you encourage each other, go off on your separate paths. It's okay. We don't need to think alike. We don't need to be alike in every respect. We don't have to have the same needs, even when it comes to what we do here when we come together in worship. My needs are not the same as your needs. They can't always be met simultaneously. That's okay. We trust that we can want different things, that we can love different gods, or no God at all, that we can have different values and walk different paths. And in some larger sense, it'll work out. We'll come together, and we will support one another through that. When we do that, I think we're modeling a different way of, not necessarily a religious community, but a different way of community in that we cease being consumers. We're not consumers of religion when we do that. We're not in the mode of, okay, I'm coming here, what am I going to get out of it? I like this, I didn't like this. If that changes, I'm out of here, whatever. We get out of that mode and into the mode of we're co-creating religion together. We're co-creating something new together. And we're taking risks, and we're supporting one another in that. It's a very different mode. And in an American society in which we are generally encouraged to be consumers, And we are generally encouraged to be thinking about what is the benefit to me? What are the risks to me? What's the calculus there? It's refreshing to have an environment that's very, very different. Very, very different way of being together. If we can create a network of trusting, loving relationships such that people of all different beliefs can be in community together, can support one another, encourage one another. If I can be happy for the parts of worship that do nothing for me, knowing that they are feeding your soul, then I think the medium there is the message. We're upholding something special for other people to look at. Our third principle calls us to affirm and promote encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. We are the congregation. To the extent that that happens, it happens because we do it for one another. And I would suggest that some of the tools that we have to do that come out of things like the channel circles, deep listening, honest engagement, speaking our truth in trust that the other person will hear it with a teachable heart and not with the spirit of cavilling and contradiction. And I leave you with the question and the challenge today to think about, if we are committed to this vision, if we see the value in this way of life, how best can we nourish not just our own spirit, but the spirit of the person beside us? And I invite you to consider that question in the best Puritan spirit of meekness, mildness, humbleness, charity, tenderness, and love. How can we walk this path together, supporting one another, trusting one another? How can we approach one another with that teachable heart that allows something magical to happen? Blessed be, and amen. Would you please rise and embody your spirit for closing hymn number